in your history as a police officer, how many cases have you been involved in where the accusation is that the person's been murdered and the murder weapon is a religious statue? How many of those cases have you been involved in?
I can't recall any.
No, this would be the one.
Yes.
Yeah, and in all of your career, how many times has a suspect who's just been interviewed made a confession that she killed the deceased using a religious statue? How many times has that happened?
Never, as far as I can recall.
No, but you say it somehow just went out of your mind.
Yes.
Just a reminder that we're listening to Katia Piliotis's application to have the Supreme Court of Victoria put a permanent stay on the charge of murdering Alaya Abdulmessa at his East Kew home in 2005. This was because after 4 trials, an appeal, and serious problems emerging with much of the police evidence, it was getting increasingly tough for Karcher to get a fair go. The hearing took place in late 2020, and with the prosecution still preparing to present Karcher at a 5th murder trial. We pick up with Karcher's barrister, Dermot Dan, attempting to shoot holes in Ryan's sworn testimony. Presiding over it all was Justice Elizabeth Hollingworth. Karcher's fate, and that of the case against her, was in the experienced judge's hands. As you'll hear, Justice Hollingworth's ability to cut through the crap is an art form.
And I'll just articulate out loud what my concerns are. Ordinarily, one would say, if the defence want to say the police have put their heads together or they're lying or they're unreliable, etc., those are matters for the jury. Those are classic matters for the jury to assess. That's at one end of the scale. At another end of the scale is the police are all lying and they're corrupt, and that's directly contrary to the administration of justice. The problem we might have is that this case may float somewhere in between the two extremes.
From the start, Hollingworth made clear this unusual legal hearing was too important and complex to rush. Given the stakes, Dan was to have the time he needed to cross-examine Ryan and other detectives.
That's my concern, and you've got such a high bar to face. I'm more concerned to make sure you call all the witnesses you need to call and that all footage needs to be put is put. I'm not telling you how to run your case, but I'm not feeling the time pressure. I'm feeling the need to make sure that all the gates are closed if you want to put the arguments you want to put.
Justice Hollingworth was presiding from inside the Queen Victoria-era stone and wood panelled grandeur of the Supreme Court building in Melbourne. When she talked about the high bar Dan faced, she meant that the challenge before him, to convince the court to grant a stay on what to most of us is the most serious criminal charge of all, was immense. Ryan, who was wearing a crisp white shirt, was giving evidence via video link. Katia was also tuned in. Remember, last episode ended with Hollingworth pressuring Ryan to read through a particular passage in Sue Reddie's interview with police.
Have you found it yet, Mr. Ryan?
No, I haven't started looking. Would you like me to start?
Yes, no, start looking. You're supposed to be looking for this because we're not moving on until we've addressed this issue.
I'm Richard Baker, and this is episode 6 of The Confession.
Now, when you say it was put to her, what do you mean it was put to her?
Dermot Dan's question referred to something Ryan had claimed in a sworn statement he'd made to police. This was after his missing police diary mysteriously turned up sometime after Karcher's 4th trial. Ryan had suggested the reason Sue nominated the statue as a murder weapon was because his colleague, Detective Newman, had put to Sue that a Jesus statue was involved in Alaya's death.
My recollection, having read it, was that Detective Newman had suggested, to prompt her memory, it appeared, that a statue of Jesus had been used.
Well, what if I suggest that you're absolutely wrong about that?
Oh, I could be.
Justice Hollingworth now asked for the relevant sections of Sue's police interview to be read out aloud for her. She wanted to focus on the witness.
I'd like to see Mr. Ryan's face. Mr. Ryan, Mr. Dan...
In the interview, Newman asked Sue if she considered Alaya a religious man. She answers that she remembers him having a crucifix hanging in his car. Newman then asks if she can recall religious images or statues placed about his house. Sue says she thinks there's a picture of God in his bedroom, and that's about it.
I think there was a picture of God or something or other.
Yes.
Yeah. just an ordinary small thing.
And whereabouts was that photo? Can you remember?
I think, I'm not, confusing.
Yeah, it can be.
Yeah, I think it was in the, you know, the lounge room. I think it could be somewhere else, but I'm sure it's the photo of God. You know, with his heart.
Okay.
She was asked simply whether she had any recollection of statues at the premises. She wasn't asked, and it wasn't put to her, that a statue had been used to murder this man. You accept that?
Yes. Yep.
Then why did you put in your most recent statement the thing that's just been put to you about what had been put to her in the record of interview? What was that based on?
Ryan didn't have a good answer to this question, or many others. He struggled to explain his previous assertion that he would have told his homicide squad colleagues about Sue having supposedly withdrawn her confession. Under sustained questioning from Dan, Ryan now admitted he wasn't sure if he had actually told them about Sue's recantation. And then, of course, there was Sue's other confession, the one that emerged when Ryan's lost diary reappeared, and which Ryan had apparently entirely, or conveniently, forgotten. Dan went for the jugular.
In all of your career, how many times has a suspect who's just been interviewed made a confession that she killed the deceased using a religious statue? How many times has that happened?
Never, as far as I can recall.
No, but you say it somehow just went out of your mind.
Yes.
I'll put it to you again that the whole story about a recantation is a fabrication.
No.
That everything about the surrounding circumstances, including that there were no notes, including your lack of response at the time of the email, including the fact that you didn't raise her confession to you in this alleged recantation, everything points to the fact that it is a fabrication. What do you say about that?
No, as I've mentioned, my memory is and was and still is that I recorded those notes in my diary, and I was mistaken because they don't appear in my diary. But again, as I've mentioned a number of times, probably 8 or 10 times, if I don't have a memory of the confessions that you speak of, how could I possibly give evidence in relation to them at any trial?
We're going to hear a lot about memory in the next half hour or so, and a lot about forgetting.
I've been put in a position where the diaries have gone missing through no fault of my own, and 15 years has gone by, and I've been asked to rely on my memory, and that's what I've done to the best of my ability.
Yeah, but you can remember on your account, you can remember a recantation.
Yes.
But you can't remember a confession by the same person.
A couple of confessions.
Dan finished his cross-examination of Ryan with a statement as much as a question.
It just so happens that in the prosecution of Miss Piliotis, it suits the police case for there to be a recantation, but it doesn't suit the police case for there to be extra confessions by Susan Reddie. Have you thought that through?
No.
Oh, thank you.
That completes your evidence. Just before you disconnect, do not discuss your evidence with anybody.
It did make me really, really angry that he dragged that piece of evidence on.
Karcher was fuming by the time Ryan's cross-examination was done. For 3 years, he'd told juries that Sue Reddie had made up her confession to her carer, and that his police diary would confirm this.
If he wasn't telling the truth about the diary, what else is he not telling the truth about? And not just him, all the other officers and people that were involved in my case, what else are they not telling the truth about? It made me really, really angry because this case was built around me. My reputation, my family name was dragged through the mud, dragged through the media, and the police were always there pointing the finger at me.
A couple of weeks before Ryan's diaries were discovered in 2020, Melbourne Law School professor Jeremy Gantz put out a series of tweets about the Piliotis case. In one, he said, "There's lots baffling about this case, but I'd tentatively add this one to the growing list of cases where Victoria's DPP seems to have lost its bearings." I met Gantz, who has a kind face and is an eager conversationalist, at his Brookfield office in June 2022 and asked him to expand.
So here we had police making decisions throughout the investigation about who to investigate and what to follow up and who to target and who to not target.
On top of the police's decision not to follow up on Sue's confession to her carer, Ross Bracken, Gantz was worried about the cumulative effect of Katia's trials repeatedly failing to go the distance.
And so it's a growing bundle of errors that I think it does add up to something that's a bit unique and is more than the ordinary oppression, just in terms of the time and the chain of events.
Then the shock of Ryan's diary.
And then the final bit of it is the reveal at the end about questions about the police officer's records, about a central claim in the case. And once you throw that into the mix, you really have the makings of a classic miscarriage of justice, where there were just so many decisions that could have gone a different way.
I've previously described the justice system as being like a living, continuously evolving organism. What you're hearing now, 3 days of cross-examination in late 2020 of the police who investigated Elia's murder, is the justice system trying to repair itself. It can be a disorientating listen at times, as Katia's barrister doggedly probes some highly experienced officers to get them to actually answer the questions they've been asked. Watching footage of the hearing, it looks at times as though the resistance Dan is confronted by has a physical effect on him.
In the notes of Mr. Ryan,
he has a habit of clutching his back as he stoops over his notes in preparation to lob another question. Or maybe it's just an old footy injury. Regardless, questions are raised and blocked repeatedly, only to resurface later in the hearing. But always circling to the same topics, and always coming back to that central puzzle of why police discounted Sue as a suspect and what evidence they chose to focus on, or not.
Would you tell the court your full name, please?
Wayne Andrew Newman.
Of all the homicide squad crew involved in the hunt for Elia's killer, none had risen as high as Newman. Back in 2005, then Detective Inspector Newman was with Ryan when they covertly recorded their chat with Sue Reddie at Uralla, her supported accommodation in Kew, and he led the formal interview with her later that day at the Homicide Squad headquarters.
This is a recommencement of a tape-recorded interview between Detective Senior Constable Newman and Susan Louise Reddie of 300.
He's now a superintendent. As we heard in an earlier episode, Newman was one of the police who referred to Sue as Crazy Sue. Now Karchers barrister, Dermot Dan, asked Newman about a nickname of his own.
Did you have a nickname at the time in your crew as Slick?
Yes, sir.
For example, Mr. Ryan, in an email correspondence, refers to the fact that Slick was with me during the Reddie aspect. That's a reference to you.
It would be, sir, yes.
Standing in the witness box, Newman looks the model of a senior police officer. His dark hair, now starting to show a tinge of silver, is neat and short. He wears a well-fitting dark blue police uniform, adorned with badges. Death and dead bodies have been a big part of his professional life. As a young policeman in 1991, Newman was part of the international forensic team that exhumed more than 250 bodies from the Santa Cruz massacre in Timor-Leste. Newman told the court he'd never heard Sue say anything about assaulting Elia with a religious statue on the night he and Ryan took her back home to Kew. But even if he had, it wouldn't have meant much to him.
I don't know that I would have done anything because I was comfortable in my mind at that stage she had no involvement in this matter. So I don't know that it would have resonated as much with me as potentially Mr. Ryan.
Based on what? She's given you a record of interview and then not long later says, actually, I beat him repeatedly around the head with a religious statue. Why on earth would you just go, oh, look, we believe what she said in the record of interview? I just don't understand why you would just ignore it.
Well, I'm not ignoring it, absolutely, Your Honour, but I just don't believe I'd formed an opinion then she hadn't.
No, that's not the question. Please don't duck the question. You answered that you wouldn't have done anything because you believed she wasn't involved. I'm wondering how, assume you were off, as you say, answering the phone at the time that Ryan has this discussion with her. If this had come to your attention, why would it not have led you to immediately go and reinvestigate the matter and wonder about whether she lied to you in the record of interview?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by reinvestigate, Your Honour.
Well, ask her some more questions.
Well, I suppose.
On it.
So other than taking her back and putting that conversation back on tape, Your Honour, that's probably the only other thing that I would have done different.
Pretty basic and obvious thing to do, isn't it?
Newman came across as extremely confident and certain of his opinions. Another thing he was confident of was that Sue had a full alibi for the period of time they believed Elia was murdered.
And what were you able to conclude as to her whereabouts at the time of the offence from your inquiries?
That she was with the people at Willow House.
For the entire period of the potential offence?
Yes.
She had a full alibi. That's your evidence?
Yes, it is.
Even after Sue's carer, Ross Bracken, gave a statement to police detailing her confession to him of bashing Elia about the head, Newman told the court it did nothing to change his mind about Sue's viability as a suspect.
Because, as I said to Her Honour, I formed the view at that stage that she had no involvement.
Why? Based on what, though?
My interaction with her, Your Honour.
The vibe. What on earth? Don't you have an open mind about a murder investigation? You've got someone who's been at the house. What had she said, or what was it that allowed you to exclude her so early on? I just don't understand.
No, it's a fair question.
It's a very fair question.
Absolutely.
One that nobody's yet answered.
Unanswered questions. As a journalist, I know that sometimes the hardest things to spot when covering a complicated story aren't the errors or the inconsistencies or the outright lies. They're relatively obvious. The tricky thing is to see what's missing, the gaps. But the challenge for Hollingworth was not just to document the gaps in the story, but to get inside them, to tease out the doubts and ambiguities that permeate the justice system. When it came to the testimony of various police officers who appeared before her in this case, it meant trying to figure out whether they were telling deliberate untruths or had they simply forgotten. Like the justice system, memory is constantly evolving. This time, Newman attempted to answer Justice Hollingworth's question by saying Sue's cognitive impairment made it difficult for her to understand things, and that he was worried she was just telling him things she thought he wanted to hear. As for Ryan's claim that Sue had recanted her confession to her Uralla carer, Newman said he couldn't recall being told that by his fellow detective, but he said it was possible he had been and he had forgotten. Echoing Ryan, Newman said he was worried he may have planted a seed in Sue's mind by mentioning a religious statue during his interview with her.
The words I used were like the Jesus or the Virgin Mary.
Virgin Mary, yeah, they're somewhere in the house.
But what can you recall about them?
Oh, I don't know, no. Sorry.
That's okay. What made you think?
It soon became obvious to everyone in the courtroom that Dan and Newman had conflicting views on many things, not the least what constituted a confession.
You were made aware that Miss Reddie had provided a confession to Mr. Bracken, her worker. Is that correct?
She'd made comments to Mr. Bracken, that's correct.
Yeah. And again, you've given evidence previously that you didn't regard what she said to Mr. Bracken as a confession. Recall giving that evidence?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, and if you had the opportunity again in a fifth trial, you'd give the same evidence, would you?
Yes.
Yeah. What was it about this that caused you to say that that wasn't a confession, what she'd said to Mr. Bracken?
For me, the understanding of a confession would be someone that's committed the act. So I think what I would term that as a false confession, because I don't believe she's the one that committed the act, but I don't dispute what she says.
Yeah. And that's the type of evidence you'd give if you had an opportunity in the fifth trial that it was a false confession.
Of course I would.
But based on what? Just your belief?
Yes, Your Honour.
This didn't go down well.
She's admitted to assaulting the man around the right time, and you've dismissed it out of hand.
So, Your Honour, I don't see where she's admitted that. I'm happy to be taken to it, but I don't know where that occurred.
All right. Well, sorry, Mr. Dan, I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm just struggling to understand the basis for this witness's evidence.
Dan reminded Newman it was he who'd taken the statement from Ross Bracken about Sue admitting assaulting Elia. But even so, Newman was adamant nothing Sue or her carer said amounted to a confession. Dan put it to Newman that he was attempting to downplay the importance of Bracken's evidence. In doing so, he'd led Newman into a trap.
I'm not trying to downplay anything, sir.
No. And you're not trying to overplay the alibi evidence, are you?
I'm not trying to do anything, sir.
No. So yesterday, I think you used the term that the evidence that you became aware of provided a total alibi for...
Full alibi, I think was his expression.
Sorry, full alibi for Miss Reddie. Remember giving that evidence yesterday?
Is that the word I used, full alibi?
While Newman didn't actually say the words full alibi, it was a proposition he'd agreed with. And it was a problem for Newman.
Yeah, and what you were talking about yesterday, the time of offending being the Sunday night.
Sunday night, Monday morning, yes.
You understand the prosecution case is that the time of the murder was Sunday morning?
No.
You've never understood that?
My belief was that from the pathologist it was Sunday night, Monday morning.
Yeah, well, I'm telling you wrong.
Okay.
Wrong in terms of what the prosecution case is. The prosecution case being that it was the Sunday morning.
Okay.
You've never been made aware of that?
I've always been the belief it was Sunday night, Monday morning.
Well, based on that, do you retract your evidence about this full alibi?
I think they still give an account that she's with them for that period.
Do they?
The they Newman referred to are the people Sue Reddie spent the weekend of Elia's death with. We got to know them in episode 3. It's true Sue spent most of the weekend with them, drinking, sleeping and having sex. But there was a gap of a few hours on the Sunday morning when the others went to cash converters to swap a toolbox for cash to buy booze, right at the time the pathologist determined Elia was killed.
Talking about the morning, not the nights. Where was she Sunday morning? Who alibis her Sunday morning?
The answer is no one. When Dan pressed Newman as to whether he'd tell another jury that Sue was fully alibied, the Crown prosecutor, Angela Ellis, objected. But Justice Hollingworth was having none of it.
I have no doubt this witness can look after himself.
And so it went.
I don't remember.
I can't recall any. I was mistaken. I could be wrong.
I'm not trying to downplay anything.
I could be right.
I've formed the view
I'm unsure.
that she had no
I
involvement.
don't have an independent recollection. My answer is I don't know.
On the 20th of March 2006, 6 months after Elia's murder, Newman and Ryan had another encounter with Sue Reddie. Remember, both detectives had repeatedly given evidence that they'd ruled her out as a suspect in the case by early October 2005. Records made by Uralla staff tell us they went to look for her at the charity's home in Kew, but she wasn't there. So Ryan and Newman went to Sue's second home, the Safeway supermarket car park, and found her. Interestingly, this meeting wasn't in the notes that Detective Newman originally provided to Karchers' lawyers in relation to the investigation of Elia's murder. That batch of documents only contained information up to the 19th of March 2006, the day before he and Ryan met Sue. Dan wanted to know why.
Now, on this day, the 20th of March, you were in company with Mr. Ryan. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Yeah. Part of what occurred on that day, the 20th of March, was that a cigarette butt was collected, a cigarette or a butt that had been part of a cigarette being smoked by Susan Reddie. You recall that?
No, I don't.
That's just vanished from your memory, has it?
I recall we seized a cigarette butt on the day we interviewed her.
28th of September?
Yes.
I'm asking about the 20th of March.
Yes, no, I realise that, sir. I realise what you're saying. I'm saying I recall distinctly one that day, but I don't recall on the 20th of March a cigarette butt being seized.
Yeah, well, that would be strange for you, wouldn't it? Because you'd already ruled her out by then. It'd be strange to be seizing a cigarette butt for the purpose of forensic testing to you because you'd already ruled her out.
I wouldn't say it's strange, but it's certainly, I don't dispute that if it was seized.
Why would you be doing it if you'd already ruled her out?
Well, I did many inquiries post the record of interview to continue to inculpate or exculpate Susan Reddie.
I've mentioned the name Stephen Fowler a few times during this podcast. He's the forensic officer who swabbed the statue of the Virgin Mary, the tin of mangoes, and other items found around Elia's dead body. Fowler gave some interesting evidence in Karchers' trials about what had happened when he informed the homicide squad crew of the DNA results from the testing he'd done at Elia's house. This was in late 2005. Here's Dan reading what Fowler said.
He's given evidence that investigators didn't believe me when I said Susan Reddie didn't match the DNA profile obtained from the profiles at the scene, crime scene. Now, did you indicate to Stephen Fowler that you couldn't believe that there hadn't been a match for Susan Reddie?
No.
You're smiling and almost laughing. Again, that would be totally at odds with your state of mind at that time.
Yes.
Yeah, and you can't explain who it was that would have provided that information to Fowler,
No.
even though you're part of a team, part of a crew where information is being shared.
I accept that.
What Dan was suggesting was that Newman's decision to provide his notes only up until the 19th of March 2006 wasn't accidental. Newman was briefly asked to leave the courtroom while Dan and prosecutor Angela Ellis discussed the timeline of the notes, with Ellis reminding the court that further records going up to the 24th of March were eventually disclosed. Justice Hollingworth had this to say.
I think with respect, what is going to be put to you, and the more we get into the evidence, the clearer this appears to be the case, is that there's been a lot of people tailoring evidence and being quite strategic about disclosure and so on. We'll come to this in due course, but it's extraordinary without some explanation as to why he picked the 19th of March. There's this critical meeting on the 20th.
Newman was recalled to the stand, and Dan asked him to accept a proposition.
You know that even what you know now, there's some massive problems with the way this investigation was conducted. Even from what we've been through this morning. You'd agree with that, wouldn't you?
Well,
So
no.
you smirk. Do you find this funny, do you?
No, I don't. I don't understand what the broad question, Your Honour. I don't understand what that means.
All right, we'll break it down.
Let's just go straight to the heart of it. You've got a person you've just interviewed for a murder who's confessed to a colleague of yours and to her worker, a confidant of hers, confidant, and there's no follow-up. There's no re-interview. That's a massive problem, isn't it?
I accept that, yes.
And not only is there a confession to your colleague, Mr. Ryan, there's a confession that involves the use of a religious statue, correct?
I now know that, yes.
Once again, Dan and Justice Hollingworth circled back to the question of why Newman had, during a 2017 trial, raised, without prompting, the prospect that maybe he'd given too much away about the religious statue used in the murder during his questioning of Sue. This appeared to clash with his earlier position that he was comfortable he'd disclosed nothing of note to Sue. And of course, Newman was adamant he'd had no knowledge of Sue having made a separate confession to Ryan until the contents of Ryan's rediscovered diary were revealed.
I don't follow what you
Why
mean.
were you volunteering that you'd gone into the Virgin Mary and the Jesus statue and you think you were suggesting leading? Why were you volunteering that in answer to a question from Mr. Dane back in September 2017?
Because I believe that's what I had done, Your Honour.
But the question that was asked of you is, you were careful not to tell her any details of the murder, and you said, I'm comfortable we didn't disclose anything.
Yes.
And then you said, and then we went to the Virgin Mary and Jesus statue. Why did you even mention that if you weren't aware of the Ryan note about the religious statue?
I don't know. That's the first I've seen of Mr. Ryan's notes.
That's what you say.
Absolutely, it's what I say.
Yeah, we have to say that, don't you?
Yes, because it's the truth.
You suggested a religious statue was the murder weapon. You think that took place in the interview, do you?
I think we asked her about the statue in the record of interview, correct?
No, but that's not what you're being asked. Please listen to the question. You're being asked, did you suggest to her that a religious statue was the murder weapon? That's the question you're being asked. Not did you discuss it, did you suggest it was the murder weapon?
I don't know that I did that. I'd have to look at the record of interview. I don't think I did that.
Yeah, well, I'm putting to you, you did not do that.
Okay, I accept that.
But again, you're giving this evidence in trial 4, what you say just totally unconnected with the confession that had been made to Mr. Ryan back in 2005 about killing this man with the use of a religious statue. This evidence is totally unconnected to that.
Of course.
Justice Hollingworth was even more direct.
What's being put to you is that you know by this stage that Ryan has got a note or that Ryan has a memory or something of that sort. That's how it's put, Mr. Dan?
Exactly. But
and you're trying to help him out by saying, oh, look, maybe I suggested it to her in the record of interview. Maybe I put the words in her mouth, and that's why we didn't follow up on her confession that a religious statue was used, because it's probably my fault. I gave her the idea in the record of interview. Do you understand the line of questioning that's being put to you?
I understand that, but I don't...
Newman may have understood, but he disagreed. He told the court he would still give evidence before a jury that he was concerned he'd led Sue on.
But what's its relevance? Why mention it? If you didn't know that she'd made a confession in those terms, why would you even mention it? What did it have to do with anything?
Because I was asked about my concerns during the record of interview.
Eventually, Dan and Newman found some common ground. Newman accepted Dan's suggestion that there had been, quote, a massive problem with Karchers' previous trials because of the further confessions by Sue, as detailed in Ryan's diaries. But still, he wouldn't go so far to agree that the investigation into Elia's death had been botched.
I think there's aspects of that investigation we could have done better, absolutely.
Giving evidence at the Royal Commission, those directly involved with registering Nicola Gobbo as a police informer. Evidence emerged of flings with police officers. Detective Senior Sergeant Tim Argyle, who registered Gobbo in 1995, told the Commission...
There was an occasion where you had an episode of physical intimacy with her, if we can put it that way.
Yes.
Was that the only occasion that occurred?
Yes.
Several more detectives from the homicide squad crew were cross-examined by Karchers' barrister as part of the stay application. But the last one we'll briefly hear from is Detective Senior Sergeant Timothy Argyle. His testimony in Karchers' stay application in November 2020 was his second high-profile court appearance in a year. That audio was from an ABC News report a year earlier, after Argyle admitted to a Royal Commission that he'd had a physical relationship with Gobbo. Her role as a double agent giving legal advice to her criminal clients while secretly informing the police marked one of the darkest chapters in Victorian policing history. Like Ryan, Argyle gave evidence via a video link.
My full name is Timothy Robert Argyle.
He's a heavy-set, middle-aged man who looks like he could handle himself if things got rough. As we know, Argyle was alongside Newman when Sue Reddie was brought into the homicide squad office for a formal interview on the 28th of September 2005.
Have you got any questions at this stage, Detective Sergeant Argyle?
When you were down at the this place that you were talking...
And it seemed that he saw Sue differently to Ryan and Newman, at least for a while.
She was still someone of interest, but she clearly wasn't charged. She was released. She was someone that was still of interest to the investigation.
Was she still a suspect?
I suppose the broad answer is yes.
On the other hand, Argyle was the only member of the homicide crew who, in a somewhat vague way, supported Ryan's evidence of Sue withdrawing her confession. He said he could remember sitting at his desk in the squad's office, attending to some other matter, when the rest of the crew started talking about their doubts about Sue being the killer.
One point I recall was that I believe it was Ryan talking about a confession that she'd made and that she'd since recanted that confession.
But Argyle was having trouble remembering which confession Ryan was referring to. Was it what Sue had told Newman and Argyle about hitting Elia with something round and hard? Or was it what she'd told her carer, Ross Bracken, about bludgeoning Elia with a blue and white object? Or maybe it was the religious statue that Ryan's diary recorded Sue as mentioning.
I'm not sure whether I was confused about whether it was the version she'd given to us in the interview, the recorded interview with the homicide squad, or some other version that she'd given.
He told the court he couldn't remember Ryan, a man he'd previously described as a good communicator, telling him about Uralla carer Ross Bracken's report of a confession from Sue. But Argyle said he could now remember hearing something about Sue admitting to somebody that she'd hit Elia with a religious statue. And even though he'd admitted at the start of his examination that he considered Sue was still a potential suspect after her interview at the homicide squad office, Argyle too went on to say that he'd tell any future jury that right from the get-go, he didn't think Sue killed Elia. Justice Hollingworth had heard enough.
It's more that you're trying to clarify that he's going to give, like all the other witnesses, a very unbalanced version of evidence in which he's absolutely adamant about things that suit the prosecution case and has no memory of things that suit the defence case. That's how I understand this line of cross-examination is going.
Exactly. Justice Hollingworth continued.
It's very unfair the way these witnesses have very selective memory, whether it's deliberate or accidental. It's unfair.
She said it was for Dan to argue whether this was a cock-up or a conspiracy, or something in between.
Whether it's a deliberate and dishonest, almost, I won't say a conspiracy to, etc., but that's a much higher threshold, or whether it's that the waters have become so muddied now and the way that these witnesses give evidence is very difficult for a jury to unravel.
Dan was almost finished with Argyle when he took into the circumstances of the police helping themselves to a DNA sample from Sue in March 2006, 6 months after she'd been ruled out as a suspect. He asked Argyle about some notes from forensic scientist Stephen Fowler, which mentioned police needing a court order to get a DNA sample from a mentally impaired person such as Sue.
Can you just explain that to us?
Well, I understand that to be the process, that someone with a mental impairment can't consent to a DNA sample, so the process that you described makes sense that we would have had to apply to the court.
But was there an application to the court in respect of Susan Reddie?
I don't remember.
Are you saying you've got no memory or can't assist us how it was that a sample of her DNA was said to be tested in this case? You can't tell us that.
I don't remember whether a court order was obtained or how a reference sample was obtained.
Well, if a court order was required, what do you say as to the legitimacy of picking up a cigarette butt that she was smoking, or part of a cigarette that she was smoking, and using that as a means of testing?
I'm not sure I can offer an opinion on the legitimacy of that.
Why not?
Well, I suppose if you require a court order, you should be doing it with a court order.
But we have evidence in this case that as late as the 20th of March 2006, a part of a cigarette that Miss Reddie had been smoking was seized by police in a covert way for the basis of further DNA testing in respect of Susan Reddie. You understand that?
I understand that, yes.
None of the police questioned could explain why a fresh DNA sample had been sought from Sue, and seemingly without the required court order, 6 months after they said they wrote her off as a suspect. Yet all said they would be prepared to tell a jury once more that they didn't think there was much of a case for Sue being Eliah's killer. Something I've found myself thinking a lot about while exploring this case is the role of luck, or fate if you like, in all our lives, but particularly Karchers. What if Karcher hadn't been pulled over that day by police in South Australia for driving an unregistered car? Or on the other hand, what about the timing of the High Court's McKell decision on the bounds of judicial commentary in early 2019? Without the McKell case, Katia may not have been able to even mount, let alone win, the appeal of her murder conviction and 19-year jail term. And if that was the case, then Ryan's diary would never have been discovered because there would have been no need to look for it. No diary, no stay application. And the deeply concerning elements of Eliah's murder investigation and police interactions with Sue Reddie would have remained forever unknown. The concept of luck wasn't lost on Katia.
There's just a lot of women who also didn't seem and sound as lucky and as fortunate as I was. A lot of women, they may not have necessarily had family waiting for them. Their family may have severed contact with them or just cut all ties with them.
And then there was Sue Reddie. What about her? What happened to her luck? I don't pretend to know the answer, except that it seemed to be in short supply. To me, Sue looked like someone who was too often ignored in life and then erased in death. From the start, I've said this podcast isn't about ascertaining Karchers or Sue Reddie's guilt or innocence, but about turning the lens on the system of judgment itself. What happens when it goes wrong? How does the system set about fixing, or at least containing, the problem? And ultimately, what and who is the collateral damage along the way? And it's also about a kind of old-fashioned idea: fairness. In the end, it was up to Justice Hollingworth to decide on whether that system, after all that had happened, was capable of being fair to Karcher while simultaneously delivering justice for Eliah. And just before we hear from her, I want to say that when it comes to luck, I reckon Katia got lucky in having her stay application heard by a judge as rigorous, thoughtful, and willing to take the time to pick apart all this complexity in the courtroom.
Honestly, the amount of speculating, and it is a matter, I say this because it's something that I think you're both going to have to address.
I've spoken with numerous people involved in the criminal justice system about the Piliotis case, and nearly everyone has commented on the perceptive vigour of Justice Hollingworth's closing remarks.
Leave aside questions of dishonesty. One of the problems is these witnesses are very, very persuasive. They're professional witnesses. they give evidence, and unless they're pulled apart piece by piece, and sometimes it takes 3 or 4 questions to actually get them to focus, they will state very confidently a proposition as if it's God's own truth. And there is a serious problem that's troubling me about a trial in which, in order to show that these people are lying, the defence might have to bore the jury rigid for possibly a week or 2, taking them through the transcript of endless different trials and putting to them these nuanced differences. It's one thing for me as a judge who spent decades doing precisely this task. It's a really difficult, and I'm just saying it because I don't know that any of the cases have addressed this. This might be a novel point, but I am concerned about the unfairness if the only way that the defence can have a fair trial is to make a forensic decision which will completely alienate a jury. Listening to this evidence isn't easy, and having to pick the witness and go, no, as I say, sometimes it's taken 3 or 4 questions from either Mr. Dan or prosecutor or myself to actually get them to answer the question straight, or to say, actually, I don't have a memory, I'm just saying what would have happened. I am troubled about how you have a fair trial in that.
Justice Hollingworth continued.
I think a judge would have no trouble dismissing most of this evidence. It's so selective and so convenient. Some of them don't have a memory, that's fine. But those that do have a memory seem to have a memory that's overwhelmingly pro the prosecution case, and they just conveniently don't remember things that might assist the defence. And there's huge reconstruction gone on. I'm not accusing them for the most part. I'll leave Mr. Ryan. I have serious issues about Mr. Ryan's credibility, and I may well find that he's an outright liar. That was my impression last time. But with most of the others, I don't think they're lying. I think with the passage of 15 years, they've probably reconstructed, and they now firmly and genuinely believe what they're saying.
That said, she had little time for Ryan's former colleague, Detective Newman.
The next witness, the smirking superintendent, did not cover himself in glory, and whilst I wouldn't find that he was dishonest, he was not an impressive witness.
It's really rare for the public to hear a senior judge talk like this about experienced police and the impact of their evidence on the accused, on Karcher.
It's really troubling in terms of how Ms. Piliotas gets a fair trial. To unravel that involves understanding how memory works, how unconscious bias works, how you rewrite, and each time you tell the story, you're convinced more of its memory. Even the way in which so many of them, even as professional police, don't understand the difference between their memory and what's in a document. That's really troubling.
Next time on The Confession.
I hugely underestimated how I would be affected after coming out of jail.
Unfortunately, Victoria Police doesn't have a great history in terms of investigating and charging their own, including former police officers.
The state has done some wrong things that put a thumb on the scales.
The Confession is written and presented by me, Richard Baker. Our story consultant and co-writer is Kate Cole-Adams. Julia Carr-Katzel is our producer and editor. Director of podcasting is David McMillan. Tom McKendrick is head of audio. Michael Batchelard is The Age's investigations editor. Sound design and mix by Kyle Hopkins. Technical assistance from Cormac Lally. Check out The Age and Sydney Morning Herald website for bonus material and for more of Australia's best investigative journalism. And if you've found any of the content of today's episode troubling, please contact Lifeline on 13 11 14.